Shabbat Shalom. It's my pleasure to introduce our Hebrew College Rabbinic intern, Eliana Willis, who's joined us also today in a number of different roles. I hope everyone's gotten to know her over the last half year, where she's been teaching in our religious school, teaching adults, working with me and Rabbi Kling Perkins on many different aspects of our community, including pastoral work. And it's a pleasure to have her and her husband, Zach Mayer, here this Shabbat. Shabbat
Shalom. It's wonderful to be here with you. I just got back actually from spending a couple weeks with my family in Los Angeles. And I always really appreciate when I'm home getting to hear family stories from my parents, from my relatives, especially the ones that are told so many times that they become sort of canonized in the family. And I want to share one of those stories with you today because it feels relevant to what the Parsha this week is speaking to and also to where we are and what's going on now. So the year before my parents got married, they lived in Israel. My dad was doing doctoral research in cultural anthropology, living with and studying the Orthodox Sephardi community in Jerusalem. It was also in the middle of the Gulf War. Religious communities were calling for all kinds of fasts, like many are now. And he heard that there was going to be a Ta'anit Dibur. So he knew about Ta'anit Esther and the fast of Gedalia, and he thought, okay, this is a fast that I've never heard of. Ta'anit Dibur, maybe it's like Ta'anit Devora. On the day of the fast, he showed up at Shul with his notebook and pen, ready to do his anthropologist thing, to interview people on the meaning of the fast. But the first sign that something was off was that there were trays with eggs on them and snacks and other food and drinks. And he approached someone to ask about it, and they wordlessly shooed him away. He tried to ask someone else, and the same thing happened. Meanwhile, people are silently praying. Plenty of people were eating, but nobody would talk to him and tell him what's going on. So totally confused, dejected, fed up with anthropology, he went home. And it was only the next day when he complained to his chavruta that he learned his mistake. It was a ta'anit dibur, a fast from speech. It was a day of silent prayer. I've always found this cultural misunderstanding to be deeply amusing, but I never really paused to consider the ritual itself. And only when I asked my dad about it recently did I learn that it was because of the war that the fast had been called. I imagine now that amid so much anxiety and fear and so much political noise, one would welcome the opportunity to let go of words for the day and speak only with God. What might prayer like that feel like if it was the only thing you said all day? Our Parsha this week, Va'era, begins in the middle of a conversation between Moshe and God, in a time, again, of great turmoil for the Israelites. Moshe's first attempt to convince Pharaoh to let the Israelites go has backfired, and they are forced to work even harder. So they're furious with Moshe and Aaron for making things worse, and Moshe shares this frustration with God. But God doubles down, instructing Moshe to tell the Israelites once more about God's promise to free them and deliver them to the promised land. When Moshe speaks to the Israelites, they do not listen. The Torah says their spirits were crushed by hard labor. And again, God tells Moshe to speak to Pharaoh and demand that he free the Israelites. But Moshe replies to God, the Israelites would not listen to me. How then should Pharaoh listen to me? Va'ani arel sfatayim, and I have uncircumcised lips, traditionally interpreted as a speech impediment. This might sound familiar from last week's Parsha, when God first calls upon Moshe to confront Pharaoh and lead the Israelites to freedom. Moshe brings up his difficulties with speech, but God reassures him very beautifully. God says that all abilities and disabilities come from God. God promises to be with Moshe, to be with his mouth. Why isn't this reassurance good enough for Moshe? God told him directly that it would be okay. Why is he still worried about his speech? This is the question that the Zohar asks. The Zohar, the mystical midrashic commentary on the Torah, it answers that while the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt, not only were the people in exile, but dibur, speech itself, was in exile. The Zohar distinguishes between kol, voice, and dibur, speech. Under slavery, the Israelites and Moshe were unable to give words to their experience. They are, however, able to cry out with their voices. Before God ever speaks to Moshe, what reminds God that the Israelites are in Egypt and are suffering is their crying out. The Torah says the Israelites were groaning under the bondage and shouted out. Their cry from the bondage rose up to God. God heard their moaning, and God remembered the covenant with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob. 4 different words for how the Israelites give voice to their suffering, all without even uttering a word. And so kol, the unadulterated outpouring of emotion through the voice, is accessible in Egypt, and it's a powerful way to reach God. But it will not be enough for Moshe to confront Pharaoh. The Sfas Emes, the 19th century Polish Hasidic teacher, builds on the idea from the Zohar of the exile of speech. The reason Moshe is said to have uncircumcised lips is not that he has a physical problem speaking. It is because the Israelites refuse to listen. The prophet prophesies by the power of those who listen, he says. So the reason speech is in exile is because in Egypt, there is a problem with listening. When Moshe tells the Israelites God's plan to redeem them from slavery, the Torah says they did not hear Moshe mikotzer ruach va'avodah kasha, because of a shortness of spirit, or maybe a shortness of breath, of ruach, and hard labor. The commentators interpret these words and the many reasons that the Israelites, oppressed and enslaved, are unable to hear Moshe. They have no time to spare because of their crushing labor. They are afraid their taskmasters will punish them for listening to Moshe. They're too consumed by anxiety to imagine a different future. And with Moshe's first attempt to get through to Pharaoh a failure, they don't believe that freedom is even possible. But it's not only the Israelites who can't hear Moshe. Pharaoh is utterly impenetrable. Convinced he himself is a god, he is completely closed off, refusing to open himself up to anything that might bring change, to anything that might induce a shred of empathy for the Israelites, or even for his own people who suffer through the plagues. And he creates this situation of hard labor and slavery where it is impossible for the Israelites to listen to either. So speech is in exile as long as no one in Egypt is willing to hear, is willing to listen. And we find ourselves in a time right now where having honest conversations, speaking up and listening to each other is exceedingly challenging. There are times when it's hard to speak up, when it seems like everyone around us sees things a certain way and we see things a different way. Or it seems like the problems we want to address are so huge that we don't even know where to start. We might feel then, like Moshe, hesitant to speak. Sometimes, though, we might find ourselves unable to listen. Maybe we're so consumed by our own troubles to hear the concerns of another or to hear their hope. Or maybe we've elevated our own narrative, our own opinion so highly, like Pharaoh, that we close our mind to the possibility that someone else might have it right. Or we might find that kol and dibur, emotional voice and intellectual speech, are fractured within ourselves. We might find ourselves responding in a conversation entirely from a place of pain and fear, or entirely from a place of facts and history, without recognizing how our own story, our own emotion influences the way we think. But this fracturing of kol and dibur, of emotion and intellect, it's a function of exile. If we seek redemption, if we seek freedom from violence and conflict, we must be able to overcome it. And it starts on a small scale. It starts with us. We don't need to agree. Our tradition celebrates healthy disagreement, but we need to be able to speak our truths and to hear each other. When Moshe asks God how he can speak up to Pharaoh, given his problem with speech, the next verse is not a response from God trying to convince Moshe that it isn't a problem. The next verse is Vayedaber Adonai el Moshe ve'el Aharon. God spoke to Moshe and to Aaron, regarding the Israelites in Pharaoh, instructing them to deliver the Israelites from the land of Egypt. Instead of expecting Moshe to do it alone, God reminds Moshe that his brother Aaron is there to help him, and God speaks to both of them. Apparently, even while speech is in exile, Aaron has some capacity for it. Moshe has voice and Aaron has speech. What one cannot do alone, they can do together. In Pirkei Avot, and we actually read this last night before Kabbalat Shabbat, Hillel teaches, be like the disciples of Aaron, loving peace and pursuing peace. Interpretations of this statement explain that when people were quarreling, Aaron would get directly involved and help them make up. It seems that in a society where no one is hearing each other, Aaron has the capacity to pause and to listen. Because he listens and understands, he can speak with integrity and with power. And by making Moshe feel heard, he empowers Moshe to speak too. Sometimes just being able to open up to one person and feel heard can have a profound impact on us. The Sfas Emes gives us guidance on how to listen well. He writes, hearing requires being empty of everything. This is the essence of exile today as well, writing in his own time. And he says, our inability to empty ourselves, to forget this world's vanities, so that we empty the heart to hear God's word without any distracting thought. This is the idea also behind fasting from speech, as my dad discovered in Jerusalem during another difficult time for our people. The Sfas Emes's advice and the practice of Ta'anit Dibur, of emptying ourselves so we can hear, is meant to help us to listen to God. And I think it can also help us consider how we listen to other people as well. We can notice, what is it that impedes us from listening? Whether it's being busy, our fears, our attachment to one narrative. And we can try to suspend them, if only for a moment, to make some space within ourselves to hear something new. And it's this openness which finally brings speech out of exile. The Zohar teaches that speech was redeemed at Sinai. The experience of Sinai is at once emotional and clear in purpose, expressing kol, emotional voice, and dibur, articulate speech, all at once. This can only happen when the Israelites had prepared themselves to hear the word of God. When they're free from slavery, unburdened by labor and the narrative of hopelessness, they open themselves up to hearing something new. So I want to bless us that we can be like Moshe and Aaron, brave enough to speak up and open enough to listen. And may our listening and our honest conversations bring us closer to peace. Shabbat shalom.
Invite those who are joining Barbara for Musaf meditation to head to the Pious Chapel.